Welcome to Flavor Text, a podcast that explores the intersection between lore, story, and gameplay in Arkham Horror, the card game. I'm CrabbyTerror8, and I'm joined, as usual, by my perspicacious co-host, Kevling.
Perspicacious? I'm not even going to pretend to know what that means.
Yeah, I had to look it up. And we are also joined with a very special guest this time. The one and only Nate, Lost in Time and Space of the Great Old Ones podcast and creator of Horrors Without Borders, the annual charity stream. Hi, Nate. How are you?
Oh, hi, Robin. Hi, Kevin. Nice to be on the show with you guys.
Oh, it's great to have you here. Yeah, really stoked to do this episode. Yeah.
I can't wait until I get to start being heckled on the show.
It's kind of a minor miracle that we managed to all be in the same place at the same time at reasonable hours of the day, actually. So it's kind of a miracle with Australia, the East Coast, and the UK. So that was a plus.
That is, especially considering that I'm always seeming to be lost in time and space. So I don't really know what that's all about.
Oh, boy. So, have we been doing anything interesting Arkham Horror-wise the last week or so?
No, but unfortunately everyone else from the show seemed to have great fun playing Fortune and Folly last week, and I sadly had to do calculus homework, so that's been my Arkham experience recently.
Like weighing the odds of the chaos bag.
Don't even get me started, man. That's not entirely true. I did manage to squeeze in a couple games of Edge of the Earth recently because I've been trying to like play a couple more rounds of that campaign, but I've been getting stuck with my wonderful luck of just drawing nothing but auto fails at seemingly the wrong times. And then just it seems that enemies like to be in piles of 3 every single time when I play solo. So I managed to like auto fail into drawing another enemy, and then I draw an enemy weakness. Oh, it's great. It's great fun. That's typical Arkham solo experience. So
yeah, very true. My only recent Arkham, we have the league started off the new round of the League of Extraordinary Investigators, and we've started off Innsmouth. So I did the first scenario of that, and didn't do too bad. I was quite pleased with myself. I wasn't horrifically killed instantly.
Bloody well, actually, I thought.
Yeah, I got 4 of the keys, I think it was, and 2 of the flashbacks. So not too bad. Not too bad on a scoring point of view. In case you're not familiar, Nate, League is League of Extraordinary Investigators. We do a solo playthrough, and then we come up with a scoring mechanism for each scenario. So generally, Robin and I are right at the bottom, aren't we?
Yeah, it's funny you have me on for this particular episode because I actually was in the league for the Carcosa campaign back.
Of course you were. Of course you were.
Yeah, that's right.
I am so sorry.
It's a long time ago. Wow. Okay. Yeah.
See, now we're all lost in time and space.
That's where we were finding our feet in the league, and we had incredibly picky scoring mechanisms and things. It's a lot more relaxed now.
That's right. Oh, there's a lot of teething around that in the early days.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I am definitely bottom of the table. I think I got 1 point. But to be fair, I did a totally rando choice. So I got, what's the singer? What's her name? The lame... I forget her name. She put
Marie?
Yeah. Marie Lambeau. Chaos choice with no... you're supposed to put Doom on things to get extra goes. None of the cards that came in my chaos choice allow me to do that. So that my ability was completely nerfed. But
I see you're playing basically Carson at that point in solo.
Yeah, that's right. It's like, Anyway. And I didn't even look at the cards. I barely looked at them. So I'm playing the game. I'm, oh, that's a nice card. Oh, that's a good one. So I'm just, anyway, someone's got to come bottom of the table. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, someone has to do an invasive stat, I guess, so.
And I have managed to play, today actually I was playing Fortune and Folly, so I got to give that a go. So, good stuff. Yeah.
What can you tell us about it? Anything interesting?
Yeah, I mean, the main thing is that if you like The House Always Wins from Dunwich, you'll love this, because this is that sort of dialed up to 11. It's, it's really great from that perspective. It's got some really great mechanics. Sometimes the mechanics could be a bit overwrought and you like reading, but there's some great gambling mechanics in it, which are a ton of fun to do because they really are like gambling. So they've done some really great things like that.
They've added card suits and whatever to all of the cards, haven't they?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting stuff.
So you can play high stakes at the Baccarat table and things like that. So some fun things like that to do. So there was a bit of cheering and, when people, beat the odds, that kind of thing. So there was some of that stuff. So yeah.
Awesome.
Excellent. Yeah.
Yeah, our local store have just confirmed that they've got the Arkham Knights kit, so they're just trying to work out when they can put some sort of event on. So hopefully I'll be able to talk about that soon.
Excellent. Great. Fantastic. Okay. Shall we talk Carcosa and things?
I suppose we should talk shop.
Yeah. So, look, I mean, Kevling and I have been banging on about Carcosa for weeks now. So I think we'd be really interested, Nate, to hear about, your experience of the campaign. Have you played it that much? Did you play it when it first hit? What's your general experience with it?
So I actually started playing Arkham, I think it was right around the time the Depths of Yoth came out. I think that was right when I had started playing. So I actually wasn't here for Carcosa's initial release, but obviously I've played it several times. I played it for the League, in addition to all of the times I've played it on my own free time. And yeah, I mean, it's sort of a rite of passage, I think, for Arkham players in a way, that you play through Carcosa. And the Return to, I think, does add some interesting things, but I think over the years I tend to just play the original version.
Right.
I like Carcosa quite a bit. There's a lot of really interesting story aspects to it that I think work really well, but I think over the years it's not my favorite, but we can talk about that in a bit.
Okay, interesting. And have you played? So you played the Return to as well, right? So you've
yes.
Played, right? Okay. Interesting. So, what I'm interested in us chatting about is, because when I put things up on the forum, I really like the campaign, and a lot of people do. It's incredibly popular. I think it's when overwhelmingly people have incredibly positive things to say about it. So, and I mean, we certainly enjoyed it. What do we think? What do we think kind of really kind of captures that? What makes this such a beloved campaign? Generally.
I've been mulling that question over for a while, and I think what Carcosa does really well is that it makes the player the most important character in the story.
Right.
Which is a criticism I've had of, more recent campaigns, is that the player sort of feels like a standby or like a passerby in all the happenings in the campaign, whereas Carcosa, you're front and center, and I think that really resonates with players.
Yeah, because it's almost as if it's happening kind of in your head in a way, isn't it? It's almost as if it could all be completely made up. That's what people kept giving feedback. It's all in your head. You can't say that it's not contrived. And yeah. So it's very kind of self-centered, I guess so, because Dunwich is sort of, it's plucky professors sort of saving the world, isn't it? And like Edge of the Earth, you feel very kind of insignificant in this sort of huge scenarios and huge story. I hadn't sort of thought of it that way. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess with Edge of the Earth, you're like part of a large party as well, aren't you? You're not just the investigators on your mission. You're part of a bigger thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even a story like Innsmouth, like, you are sort of the the third wheel to Alina and Dawson. Like it's really their story, and you're kind of there for the ride.
Yeah, sort of discovering it as you go, sort of thing, aren't you? With all the flashbacks and everything.
Yeah, it's very Tarantino-esque in that regard.
Yeah, it's right. Oh, it's like really hard to keep track of all the flashbacks and things. But I think the thing what you say there, Nate's right. I think it even takes it a step further. It's I hate to use fancy words like this, but self-reflexive, right? There's a knowingness to Carcosa because it talks to you, the player. So not only is your character the central, but it actually kind of keeps nodding and winking at you as the player and sort of brings you into the story as the person behind the characters as well, by asking you funny interesting questions, so that you start even doubting your own kind of beliefs and sanity around things. So it's really clever how it even draws. I think people really like that about it as well, is that it draws them in that way, right? There's really clever lines that it uses where it even questions your own kind of judgment quite a bit, right?
Yeah, there's even some of that mechanically. Like, I think an example of that is when you play through Unspeakable Oath, and there's sort of this like, wait, how come I'm supposed to put this thing on this enemy, but I was never able to get that because of my decisions? Wait, what? Is this supposed to be able to be possible? And then you figure out, no, it's never going to be possible to like actually defeat this enemy based on how the mechanics of the scenario work out. So it's like, even the game itself is like throwing you into a loop a lot of the time.
Yeah, that's one of the things I don't like about the Return, is it kind of undoes that, doesn't it? And it actually lets you use the Black Clasp for various in various scenarios. Well, now that's kind of taken the fun out of it.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that the Return 2 does some good things, but it also brings with it, I think, some baggage that I don't think the campaign really needed. Whereas like some other of the Return 2 sort of kind of try to trim the fat off the campaign and make it more focused, where I feel like this one sort of didn't have much focus to add to Carcosa. So it kind of tries to add stuff, but it really doesn't contribute overall to the story. And I hate the new Whispers in Your Head cards. Those are awful.
Yeah.
Direct damage and direct horror that you just take for no reason is just obnoxious.
I mean, it's good that they fixed up The Last King, for example, because that, with Diane Devine, I mean, they fixed up some of those things. But you're right.
I do quite like The Last King. Yeah. I do play the Return to The Last King, but I think all of the other scenarios, I just play the original versions.
Yeah. I mean, the only other one, I think the two for me, also I think Dim Carcosa benefits because I think I don't know, I mean, it seems a bit ambiguous, and maybe that's a good thing. I like how it kind of just makes it a bit clearer what's going on, I suppose, with Hasta. Joke of horror with you know who, and how it sort of adds that extra layer of what the secrets are that you're trying to uncover. There's just a bit of extra stuff there. Not that it's makes that much of a difference, though, really. But I do like
just
that.
A bit of extra narrative, isn't it?
A bit of extra narrative
feeds into your previous decisions.
Yeah. So. I think the other thing it does is I think the reason people like it, and just looking at the feedback, we'll read some of the feedback a bit later, but people like it. If you think about it, the first three campaigns, including the introductory one, are what you might call the sort of the first phase or the first period of the game, where the basic mechanics were being bedded in, right? And Carcosa is really kind of the pinnacle of that period, you know what I mean? Of the sort of taking the core rules, core mechanics, not getting too clever with additional kinds of mechanics and things like that, and complexity. And I think people appreciate that it's fairly straightforward to set up. The scenarios are not overly complex. Black Star's Rise being the exception, but people find them reasonably easy to set up. But there's more complexity in it than, say, Dunwich or the introductory campaign. So it kind of gets that balance right in that way as well. I think people really like it because it's not over.
Yeah, I think Carcosa feels like a very refined and sort of elegant campaign in a lot of regards.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think another interesting aspect about this campaign is the addition of the Man in the Pallid Mask always being in someone's deck.
Yeah.
Throughout the course of the campaign, that sort of lingering threat really adds a lot of interesting complexity.
Yeah.
It's not really mechanically complex, but it's very complex both story-wise and sort of decision-wise as a player.
Yep.
You know, like, do I sit here and wait for the Man in the Pallid Mask so that I can continue to get more tallies on changing this stranger, or do I try to just get the heck out of here? Which I think, you know, like, isn't complex at all, but really adds a lot of player agency to those scenarios. That's just really cool.
Yeah, and I think the problem later is that either the mechanics in some campaigns kind of take over from the story. So I think particularly for newer players, the mechanics just get so complicated that the story gets lost in the process. Or the story itself, I think Circle Undone is one where the story itself kind of, where is it going and what's it about? It's like, what? And so I think Carcosa kind of is this Goldilocks sort of thing where the story is really compelling and interesting and engaging. The mechanics are not overly complicated, so people don't feel like they're kind of, you know, they're overly taxing. And like you say, the player agency and involvement, I think the three together kind of this sort of sweet spot for a lot of people. And I think that's, you know, I think that certainly comes through in what people are saying about it and things like that. So, yeah.
And I think over the years too, that just the whole King in Yellow aspect of the mythos has just been extraordinarily popular with people. I remember even like back in the days of like Arkham 2nd Edition, people always loved the King in Yellow expansions and always loved, like, you know, all that Carcosa related stuff. And it's always been this sort of integral part of the Arkham mythos. And, you know, people have always really latched onto that for its sort of more personal nature than its sort of cosmic nature.
Yeah.
The idea of the, you know, the fact that it plays into our perceptions as a player, and the fact that it's quite unique amongst all of the campaigns, you know, the whole doubt and conviction mechanic. I think if they reuse that campaign after campaign, it would have got old very quickly. But the fact that it is unique to Carcosa, I think that really makes it special as well.
Yeah, it does. And it's like, I know they would have been finishing the Forgotten Age right while Carcosa was, you know, and it feels like they felt we really have to change things up. So then after the Forgotten Age, it's almost like we got into much more complicated stories, and, you know, and I think for some that just gets a bit, you know, it kind of doesn't quite have that perfect, you know.
Yeah, I think at least like storytelling wise, that Circle Undone is sort of the turning point.
Yeah.
For how stories are told in Arkham.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's like the first three major campaigns have this very like similar style to how their stories are told, and they're very player focused.
Yep.
And then the more recent campaigns have been sort of more party focused or more events. Like the investigators are sort of bystanders to what's going on a lot of the time in more recent campaigns.
Yeah. So what's not so, from your perspective, Nate, what's not so hot about, because, you know, I think Kevlin and I spent a lot of time when we did, we said nice things about it, but we also criticized some things gently now and again, but we got a bit of pushback from our listeners. But that's okay. What for you is perhaps less successful about Carcosa then? Because I think it's always interesting from a gameplay and mechanics perspective to think about that as well. I mean, nothing's ever going to be perfect.
Yeah, I think, you know, there are a couple story contrivances that always kind of irk me, especially as a primarily tabletop role-playing player. You know, I'm a forever GM, so story is a big thing for me in this game. And the contrivance of going to the asylum and then all of a sudden kind of dropping your bags and going to France and going off and doing this investigation has always been a bit weird for me. But okay, I guess.
Yeah.
And you know, some of the scenarios don't really land for me mechanically. You know, I think like Echoes of the Past and Black Star's Rise are kind of the two standouts for me, at least. But you know, all the other scenarios are great. I think for me, at least, my favorite is probably Curtain Call, simply due to how difficult it can be to create that really good hook in a story, and Curtain Call just does that so well.
Do you mean that kind of starting, the way it starts with the theater?
And the introduction of the man in the pallid mask, sort of like, you know, wandering around the theater, and then the whole scene at the end where spoilers.
I think we're
drop the vase spoiler alert real quick, and
I think if you
know, the whole building catches on fire, and it's you got the emissary chasing you. It's just like, it's a really great story buildup. You've got this like weird happening, and then you've got the second act where the man in the pallid mask shows up, and then all hell breaks loose. And this like interesting like looping back and forth between Act 2 and Act 3, and like making sure that you have this like properly timed out so that you get out, but also get the emissary victory points. Like that tug and pull is really fascinating to me, and it's really well done in that scenario.
Yeah.
Even the basics about the map layout, I really like about that. How they introduced the idea of the sort of the physicality of the locations, that you can jump from the balcony down into the theatre, but you can't get back up, and you hurt yourself on the way. It's just introducing things like that. Excellent. Yeah.
Did they use three-dimensional sort of? And is it only until Edge of the Earth that we saw 3D things again, where you could sort of, there were higher and lower spaces, or am I forgetting there's something else? But it's not used.
The crumbling precipice from Depths of Yoth.
Oh yes,
where you can fall off to your death.
Oh yeah,
yeah. There's a rope bridge as well, isn't there, that you can fall off?
Oh,
or is
the
that
rope
the same
bridge.
thing?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yes, it's again, it's used sparingly, isn't it? So it's great when it shows up.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing I think about Curtain Call is that sometimes you can just be unlucky and go to one end of one end of the map, and then the man in the pallid mask turns up at the other end of the map. Isn't there? There's that thing where you can end up going, oh, you know, there's a bit of that kind of, just by pure luck, you might just happen to be on the right side, and the man turns up on the right side, or you could have it the other way, where you end up having to traipse all the way over to the other side. But you know,
I think that's a kind of a side effect of true solo, that is, though, isn't it? Whereas at least if you're in a multiplayer game, you can cover both angles, sort of thing.
Yeah, no, it's really strong. That and The Last King. I mean, there is such a strong opening. Those two scenarios. But like you say, I think, I mean, they do stand out. I mean, definitely, I think particularly the Echoes of the Past, it just doesn't do what it's kind of wanting to do. Even I think in the Return to, I haven't played the Return to version, but the idea of sort of racing against the cults to, you know, the cult to kind of get information, that sounds like a super cool idea, but it just doesn't quite work, you know, in terms of what actually happens in the scenario. They didn't quite manage to pull that off. And I think the Return to improves that. I don't know whether it improves it enough, but it definitely is the weakest one, I think, of the...
Yeah, I would agree. It's I also kind of agree with you story-wise. Like, it is really interesting. I think it does have a lot of like interesting elements story-wise, like meeting Mr. Peabody in the secret library and learning unknown knowledge about the King in Yellow. Like, that's really cool story-wise, but the mechanics of that story, or the mechanics of that scenario, really let the story down in that regard, which is disappointing. And I don't think the Return to really does enough. It sort of feels like you're putting a Band-Aid on a broken arm at that point.
Yes.
And the difficulty with that is, like, what do you do to make the story compelling? Or, like, what do you do to make the mechanics of that compelling? And that's a question I don't have an answer to.
No.
But I really like the map layout of that scenario quite a bit. You know, I like the like different floors and how you could like go through floors through secret passages. Like that's really cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, the whole thing with the Doom and the cultists just doesn't work.
No.
I think if they just maybe constructed a normal Doom clock and played around with the numbers, I think that would have just worked better.
Yeah.
And maybe just have more cultists spawn throughout the building.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah, they need it. Yeah, I think it's a case of, you know, it would need to be completely overhauled. I think it just doesn't sort of work.
Yeah,
really.
It's like the souffle just kind of flattened when it came out of the oven.
Yeah, and I think Black Star's Rise as well is. It seems like they had this really. I mean, from a game design perspective, it's clever. But when you read the Reddits, like the most challenging aspect of the scenario is setting the bloody thing up. Like people just find it so difficult to work out what they're supposed to be doing. I know we found that, didn't we, Kevling? Like
it was hard enough just talking about it. Yeah.
You know, and it seems unnecessarily complicated. Like, do we really need like these two agendas and compete? It's just overly overdone, really, for what? I mean, it just not necessary at all. So
yeah, that scenario feels like a crapshoot sometimes, where you're sort of just like hoping you're lucky with the agenda that you choose. You're like, well, I hope I get the right one, and oh crap, I didn't. Well, I guess I'm gonna have to doom out the other one now. So you like the story is kind of interesting. You know, you escape the catacombs out into the middle of France, and all hell breaks loose, and you sort of have to figure out what's going on and get to the top of the mountain or whatever, essentially. And it's like kind of interesting, and you've got like, you know, that interesting map layout with like the ports of France, and then you go out into the abbey, and that's all well and good, but the whole agenda thing I think really kind of sours all of that with making it feel out of your control.
Yeah.
Which is funny because a lot of the campaign really feels like in the player's control. You know, it's very much like the decisions you make like affect how you play. Gosh, what's the fifth scenario? Not Court of the Dragon. Goodness, but it's based on Court of the Dragon.
Oh,
anyway,
you mean? Or...
Thank you. Yes. You know, like a lot of that plays around your story choices, and then all of a sudden you have this scenario that's just like, well, hope you make the right decision, and then if you don't, that sucks.
So talk to me a bit about what you were saying before about, because I quite like we're off to France now, I quite like the sort of globe-trotting aspect of it, but you're saying it's a bit sort of over-contrived, or it's a bit contrived that you're just sort of suddenly packing your bags and off to Paris. And
yeah, I mean, I get why from a story perspective you'd want to do that, you know, especially if you're playing someone like Jenny, it makes sense.
Yeah,
but like not for every investigator, and I don't really expect the game designers to like account for every single investigator's occupation and come up with like some reasonable explanation as to why all of their characters are going to like that would be absurd. But you know, I do think that there is certainly a way that you could perhaps kind of smooth that over a little bit. Right. You know, like I can believe why someone would go to Antarctica, for instance, but I think in this circumstance, there just wasn't enough reason for the investigators to suddenly go to France.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, there is some information about the author and the book coming from France, but why would that bring you to France all of a sudden?
All the way there. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, why wouldn't I just like go to Boston or something and then do some more research first or something along those lines?
Yeah.
But
I think we said something similar, didn't we, when we were talking about it? Because it's all down to how that previous scenario ended, wasn't it? Whether you met Nigel or whether Nigel was dead and you found his book and all of that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. You're right. It's not a connective leap, is it? To go right, okay, yeah, off we go. It's not enough there to drive that decision to go halfway around the world on a whim.
But I get why, because the rest of the scenarios are really good, like storytelling wise. Like once you get to France, that's fine. But it's just like that one little gap that it's sort of
And if you get out of the asylum without what's his face, the Daniel, he then suddenly just miraculously turns up dead in your apartment one day.
Or does he?
Oh, does he?
Sorry, I'm just doing a bit of doubt there for you.
And that one's the most contrived of all. It's like you go back to your apartment and he's there dead, clutching a book. Oh, okay. How did he get there, or why is he there? You're right. So they really do kind of twist themselves with this contrivance to get you to go to Europe, right? So yeah. Or did we? Maybe we never went to Europe. Maybe we just imagined.
We imagined the whole thing. Yes.
Oh, jeez.
The bugbear that I have that people push back was actually for me was the Phantom of Truth, where you're in the situation where you're chased, not where you're chasing the organist, but where the organist is chasing you, and somehow he's chasing you, and you find Nigel Ingram. Like, I get the idea that if you're chasing him, you succeed in chasing him to the point where you find Nigel Ingram. But I could never, in my own mind, work out that if he's chasing you, how do you end up finding Nigel Ingram? Because how does that work? You know what I mean? So I find that unsatisfying from that perspective, because he's like chasing you and suddenly you find his house miraculously.
Yeah. So. I don't think it's that big of a deal personally, but I can get where you're coming from in that regard. Yeah. It's kind of one of those like GM moves where you sort of got to lead the players to the water in order for them to drink.
Yes.
And, you got to get the player there somehow. And that's, I guess, the way they decided to do that. Like, I don't think it's the worst way to do it, honestly. Like, you could explain it by like, oh, you're running away from the organist and you happened to turn the right corner and there's Nigel's house.
Yeah.
Like, it's a bit contrived, but whatever.
Actually, friend of the show and actually someone on the league, Leroy he was one of the people who wasn't so keen on Carcosa. He said, my gaming group and I are amongst the outliers who don't enjoy this campaign as much. To its credit, it's among the simpler campaigns to set up and play, which is a rarity that's becoming more missed. But it also experimented with Doom in some novel ways. The downsides have more to do with the story that alludes to horror more than actually delivering on it. The idea that everything might actually all be a dream, in inverted commas, makes it hard to see your investigator in a heroic light. The narrative is about your investigator too much, in fact, such that instead of trying to turn the tides of fate, you're trying to convince yourself of justifications for questionable actions. As far as the gameplay go, I appreciate the design elements much more now, especially the standalone experience. So I think that's the point. He's saying that's one of the downsides of it. It's a bit too personal. It's really just about convincing yourself one way or the other whether the whole thing is real or not, rather than actually achieving something for the good of the world, I suppose. I guess he's saying.
Yeah, I guess, but I mean, that is kind of the whole point of Chambers' work, is that, it's sort of this like self-defeating, like, it's not really cosmic horror, it's, horror of the self. It's, the reflection of all the decisions you make throughout your life. It's about, like, what do I do in the face of my own horror, rather than trying to defeat some eldritch thing. It's about defeating the eldritch thing inside yourself. So yes, it's intentionally, I think, meant to be personal in that regard, because that's how the source material is treated.
Yeah.
I think a lot of players sort of have this mistake because, the two sides of the mythos have really been intertwined over the years with the Arkham IP. But, when you read Chambers' work, it's very different from the work of H.P. Lovecraft. Whereas, Lovecraft was very, anti-human in a lot of his work. Chambers isn't. Chambers is very romantic in a way about humanity, and a lot of his writing.
Yeah.
And a lot of his writing is also really bad. But he wrote some really terrible romance novels, but Chambers has a much different attitude about humanity in that regard. And I think a lot of that is really reflected pretty well in the campaign. Yes. Whereas it does feel more personal, but that's by design. And, if you don't like that sort of thing, then I think that makes sense why they would have that opinion.
Yeah. Yes, you're right, because I like Lovecraft, where essentially, human beings are sort of powerless, ultimately. Whereas Chambers' view is where the creation of art, whether it's writing or plays or, sculpture or whatever it is incredibly powerful to the point that you can literally change reality, right? So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, he and I guess it reflects their lives, because their lives are so incredibly different. Chambers was very worldly and sophisticated in many ways, and Lovecraft was incredibly isolated, and they have a very different kind of experience of the world.
And their influences are very similar. I think Amboir's Beers definitely influenced the two of them, and they have similar kind of tastes, and definitely Lovecraft took inspiration from some of the things that Chambers was doing, as he definitely incorporated some aspects of it. But overall they are very different sides of the mythos, and it's interesting how those two things have sort of been conflated over the years because of their interconnection with the Arkham IP and sort of their overall general weird tentacle vibe going on.
Yeah, so Casey Campbell, this was on the Arkham Horror, the card game Facebook forum, says, it's a very strong campaign. It's a really good story, no bad scenarios, and it has fewer gimmicks. I don't mean gimmicks in a bad way. I like how the following campaigns change things up. This one hits a lot of high notes without changing what you think of as the core game formula too much. I think that's right. I think it represents that kind of high point of the early, I think let's talk about this before, but the problem with that is you just can't keep churning out the same things. So, there's this impetus. You got to change stuff. But I think it's a good, it does take what has gone before and really kind of optimize it in many ways. I think it also, I don't know, but clearly MJ is a great, hugely passionate about Yellow, the King in Yellow, and because I think it comes through in this campaign. I think it really requires that kind of passion and knowledge to really pull it off, because you really need a leap of imagination. It's, like Dunwich Legacy doesn't require a huge leap of imagination to go from the story to the campaign. But I think to go from Chambers' story to Path to Carcosa was really quite a spectacular leap of imagination. I think I think that also shines through as well.
Yeah, I would agree. And Phantom of Truth is pretty much just a direct homage to The Court of the Dragon. Very much the same story in that regard. The organist chasing the lead player throughout the cities of France, or the streets of France, and yeah, it's really fascinating to see how, not only did Chambers' work influence the campaign in and of itself, but then even just other Arkham storylines with Carcosa in it as well. You can kind of see similar enemy designs and similar sort of themes throughout both games, and it's cool to see the connection and the continuity between Arkham the board game and Arkham the card game, and how these sorts of aspects of the mythos are consistent throughout those titles.
Shall I? Do you want to read what have you got, Kevling? From the you got some from the League, didn't you?
A couple of comments from fellow League players. So O'Malley says he'd like to point out that during his first playthrough of Carcosa, he had so much real life second guessing throughout the whole game. His doubt was real, and that was how the whole game grabbed him.
I think everyone has a moment like that when playing this game, where one mechanic just clicks, and you're like, "What? This game can do that?" And that's what really draws people in. I'd be curious, like, what was that for you guys?
What was that moment? I'm trying to think now. I think I can't remember where it was now. What was there was the mechanism about being hunted. I can't remember which scenario that one was in. And when there was an agenda that you'd flip and it'd say, "Why are you reading this?" Or "You are now being hunted because you've just read this piece of text." Just remember that. And you go, wait, what?
Yeah, the thing that stands out for me is when you're not allowed to say "Hasta" because, and I played it with my kids, my two daughters, and when we weren't even playing the campaign, they were like, "Do not say that name." So we had to say hash brown, and so even when we weren't playing, it seeped into our lives. It just wasn't allowed to say it at all. They're like, "Dad, don't say that name. You mustn't." It became like, for a game to kind of spill over into your life like that is
Did
is
it
rare.
then evolve further, and you found yourself not able to say hash brown anymore?
That's right. Exactly. The other thing I just remembered that I did is when you play The Last King, there's an address that you go to. Now, I Googled that address. I don't know if you've actually Googled the address. And it was one of those moments when I went, this is getting a bit too real, because if you go on Google Maps, it's like a repair place, but it's all yellow.
1428 Atlantic Avenue.
That's right. I'm like, oh, okay. This is.
There's a lot of little nods like that players, I think, have yet to discover, and when they do, I think MJ is going to be like really pleased with herself. Just like, "Ha, I got you."
Yeah.
I think for me, that moment was when I first explored. I was like, "What? That is so cool." It's like the moment where you're at the camp. And you actually like flip over the location and you explore, like you're kind of looking for trouble from all those Steve Jackson games. Like that was just brilliant to me, and it still resonates with me to this day.
What else, Kevling? Did you have any other ones?
Yeah, I've just got a quick comment from Matastrophic. He said, "The unreliable narrator is an excellent use of the medium of a card game. Still the very best campaign."
Yeah. Yes.
Just that unreliable narrator. It's a great mechanism in loads of different media, isn't it? Like when you're watching The Usual Suspect or something like that. Just adding that element of doubt, and can you really believe what you've just been told or what you think you've just seen? It's excellent stuff. And like I said earlier, I think if they did it too much, it would get old very quickly. But having that as like one of the key themes in this one campaign, it does make it stand out against all the others.
Yeah, I do quite like that aspect about this campaign. It does play into the whole doubt and conviction really well. It really does, as we were saying earlier, it really does make you actually doubt your decisions and stand by your convictions, which is really interesting. But I think once you kind of understand all of the unreliable narrator aspects of the story, like on repeated playthroughs, I think it kind of loses some of its luster in that regard. And like you were saying, if they were to do this a lot, it would kind of get old pretty quick. But I think in this campaign, it's really well done, because if they hadn't done it as well as they had, it could just kind of fall flat on its face. So it's hard to do, it's hard to make the player genuinely feel like the information that they're receiving is not just a straight lie. That there's that fine balance of where you have to make what you're saying believable, but at the same time kind of poke that little needle into their head, like, I'm not sure about that.
Yeah.
Did I really just burn down a house full of monsters, or were they just innocent people at a party?
Or was it all a dream?
Yes.
Yeah, and I think, yes, if you take it too far, it collapses in on itself, because then there's no logic to anything. You know what I mean? like it can get to the point where actually then nothing matters because it's all just all of it's so unreliable that it doesn't matter. So you're right, it's got to be this balance between enough to give the story that intrigue and unbalance and uncertainty, but not too much. And I think for me, and you're right, the effect does wear off over time. But I think for me, it's in the unspeakable oath where it dawns on you that you might actually have been an inmate there. That for me was just fantastic. That was just
this all looks very
great.
Familiar.
Yeah. I mean, they make it more explicit in the return too. Like they kind of really make it explicit that you have been an inmate there, which I don't think they needed to do. I think it was better when it was a bit more vague. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we said it earlier, but that's always been my big criticism of the return to, is that it really does kind of ruin some of the intrigue on some of the finer aspects of the campaign and kind of shoves them directly into the player's face.
Yeah.
I guess at that point, though, you've been through the campaign multiple times. You know it pretty much inside out, and it is basically adding extra game to it then at that point, isn't it? Rather than the mystery and the doubt that you have in that first playthrough, because you'll never get that again.
Yeah, that's true, I suppose, but I don't know if that's like then a good reason to then lean on that and sort of just kind of expand it mechanically. Whereas I do think that there is room to introduce more intrigue, like who gave me the ticket in the first place to go to the curtain call scenario? You know, like did some strange benefactor, like was the stranger the whole reason I was there in the first place? Or is this like a machination of my own doing? Like I think there were more aspects of the story that you could poke and prod to add some additional intrigue. Like the catacombs is another example, I think, too. You could always add more stuff to the catacombs.
Yeah. I think the subsequent playthrough thing, though, I think the problem is probably the big weakness for me around that is that once you know the campaign, why would you burn down the house? Because once you know, like burning down the house makes complete sense because it's a bit overdone. Like The Last King is great because those little bits of information you get from all of the party goers give you a little boost in each scenario, just a little bit. But there's this whole thing that you can, if you don't burn down the house, you really get this thing where these monsters turn up and they're really quite difficult to deal with. It's just easier just to burn down.
It's like one in every scenario after that point, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree. That's like that meta of, you know, the best mechanical choice versus the more interesting story choices. Yeah. That is another criticism I have of this campaign too, is like you tend to kind of always go the conviction route simply because I'm going to burn the house down. I don't want to have to deal with these things again. Screw that.
No. And you talk about contrived before. It is kind of a bit contrived. They just kind of turn up.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? They just suddenly...
It feels very video gamey in that regard.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, the final boss just kind of shows up at the right time. It's like, oh, well, that was convenient.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
They even kind of look like Bloodborne bosses in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, they do. That's so true. And they're tough, right? They're not pushovers by any stretch of the imagination. And there's no real kind of reason why they're there. It's all in your head. I don't know. But, you know, they just kind of just turn up at the most inopportune times. You're right. It is very video gamey. Yeah.
I can even see like the subtitle thing come on the screen with the lower third and the bouquet in the background. It just has like the boss and the main focus of the frame.
Yes, right.
Constance Dumaine.
Yeah. I think we were playing the Catacombs one, and like we got a really bad draw because we ended up with just a very linear run and then we're being chased by why are both of them there? I can get why one of them's there, but I can't remember which one. Was it Haruko turns up in the catacombs or something? Like, why? Why are you here?
Yeah, but anyway. They decided to come to Paris as well.
Yes, right, exactly. Oh dear. Jamie Grace Duff on the Facebook forum said, Carcosa is solid all around. I found Circle Undone to be very quirky mechanics-wise. Dunwich can be brutal. Forgotten Age is rough, but the Return to makes it better. But Carcosa just plays straight through really well. That being said, there's still one scenario my partner and I hate in that campaign so much. Doesn't actually say which one, but overall, the timing, mechanics, the monsters, etc., all make for smooth, solid gameplay. Dream Eaters was fun, but the dual campaigns were a little odd, and we haven't played it enough to really say how it ranks with the others. Innsmouth seems to run long scenario-wise, so not our favourite currently. So I think that just talks to this idea that sort of Carcosa gets the balance between complexity and story kind of pretty right.
Yeah, I like that person's point about scenario time too, because that for me is another sticking point where scenarios, the average playtime of scenario has definitely increased over the years. Yep. And, it's nice when you can play through a scenario in like 45 minutes as a solo player versus, some scenarios now can take almost 2 hours as a solo player. I think like Edge of the Earth particularly does that a lot. The scenarios are just so long.
Yeah. Long and complicated, and multiplayer takes just forever to play through them. It's interesting that Fortune and Folly is like there's actually a kind of a first half, second half, and you can play it as one continuous scenario, or it's actually designed that you can stop and come back later and do the second half as a sort of second scenario. So they've deliberately sort of split it in two. So I think clearly that's something they've been thinking about. I think so. Yeah. Jonathan Stringer on the Facebook forum said it has one of the best openers and one of the best final scenarios. There is a lot of replayability, as the conviction doubt mechanic can change the scenarios a lot. There's really only one scenario that's not good. Again, not saying which one. The rest are really good. So, I was thinking about Dim Carcosa because, like a lot of these campaigns, and, it's quite hard to get to the end because you can end up, the campaign finishes. Particularly with the Unspeakable Oath, like playing that solo, so punishing because it doesn't scale to solo play or even two-hander. I don't understand why it doesn't scale, but anyway, so I don't think a lot of people actually get to the end, to the final scenario, which is a pity because it is a good scenario. There's a lot going on in it because there's a lot of backstory, which I think it's definitely not in the King in Yellow, but there seems to be a lot of story about that Carcosa was fighting with another city or another place, or there seems to be some other backstory lore which must be other writers, or I'm not sure. But a lot of it is
a lot of it is inspired from Chambers's original works. I believe specifically like the Yellow Sign and parts of the play are explicitly like told in some of those stories, and that's what this is referencing. Yeah, it's like the fight between the kingdom of Carcosa and the other kingdoms that were sort of part of that mythology.
Yep.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting that not only do you have that barrier from scenario 4, but then you have that barrier in scenario 7 as well, where you have multiple times where you can never get to that final scenario. And I think for me, I've only honestly played it, like gotten to it at least probably 3 times, because of those barriers. In solo, it's quite brutal. And I think this campaign has pretty large maps at those critical scenarios, which makes it very difficult for solo players. Movement is the biggest thing that's been a hindrance to solo. Is like, yes, you can complete the objectives with reactions, but movement often is what kills you because you just can't get to the locations fast enough.
I think I replayed Unspeakable Oath like I just decided to keep replaying it till I beat it as true solo. I think it took me 6 times or something. It's just it's just so many tasks that you need to kind of complete, right? It's just really difficult. So and what I'm not 100% sure with Dim Carcosa, the secret that it talks about at the end. What is that? Is that ultimately you are the player? It's ultimately you that have sort of created. Is that the secret ultimately, or that the play writes reality? Is it that kind of secret? I'm not 100% sure, but I think the Return to kind of clarifies that a bit. But it's kind of a bit vague, I think, ultimately what the secret is.
I think that's sort of by intention. I think it's sort of left to you as the player to make that decision what that secret is supposed to be about. But, I think you're kind of on the right track. I think it's about, like, how do my decisions affect the rest of the world? Or how does my outlook on the world change my perception of reality? Kind of deal,
Yep.
Does my own mental state affect the world at large, or is it all just a dream in my head? And I think that's another aspect of this campaign that's really fascinating to players, is that it sort of brings these questions to the forefront of your mind when you're playing this campaign.
Yeah. And I think depending on your doubt and conviction in that Dim Carcosa final campaign, the different versions of Hasta. So if you've got a lot of, I can't remember if it's doubt or conviction, he's quite a tragic figure, really. You sort of face off against him, and he literally is this tattered kind of king of nothing, really. So it's almost like your own mental state depends on how powerful he ultimately is, which is a really cool way of kind of, because that doesn't happen in Dunwich. Like the great old one is the great old one, and you're going to face off. And the thing is, that's in some ways that's unsatisfying as well. What you bring your flamethrower and your cyclopean hammer to the table, and go to toe with a great old one. It's just, okay, but this feels more satisfying in a sense because it's more ambiguous, right?
So. Yeah, I agree. While I certainly enjoy that kind of pulpiness about Arkham, it is kind of silly that you just kind of walk up to Yog-Sothoth with a flamethrower. In space, mind you.
Yes.
In the void of space with a flamethrower. How that makes any sense. Where's the oxygen coming from? I don't know. In the vacuum of space? Whatever, man. Just hit it with a hammer.
This is an interesting post, and I do apologize that my Polish is non-existent. But Katarzyna Hankiewicz-Wasak said, Arkham Asylum is the most oppressive scenario in all the campaigns. I love it. Overall, for players in Europe like myself, the plot is very close to home, with that artistic bohemia, actors, Parisian cathedrals, and long history. If you like those aesthetics, this is your beloved campaign. For me, it's not the best one. She says, I prefer darkness, witch, and haunted house atmospheres of The Circle Undone, but definitely on the top. So I think that's interesting that, having it outside of the US and in the sort of European setting, it's I guess that, kind of engages people from different places. So I hadn't thought about that aspect. So,
and I guess from it being primarily a US-based game, having it go to Europe, it's almost a sense of the exotic for American players or people who are of that era in America, in Boston, Massachusetts. That is a completely alien part of the world, is it almost as alien as some of the great old ones themselves.
I mean, kinda. I only live like an hour north of Boston, and it is, I guess, foreign, but it's not that foreign. Well, I guess maybe not nowadays, but I've always really liked that about Arkham, the card game is how modular you can be with its locations, because you can just slap on whatever on the card and make sense of it, which is really, really fascinating about how this game's designed. And, you know, like, so much of The King in Yellow is influenced by Chambers' time in France, and, you know, he lived there for a large portion of his life, and, you know, going through the streets of Paris in Arkham is romantic and horrifying, which is just great. You know, it's nice to see how we can go from, you know, being in Massachusetts to being in France to being in the jungle to being back in Arkham to being in the Dreamlands to being in the middle of space. You know, like, that's one of the great appeals of this game, is that you can set it anywhere and it makes sense.
The thing I really appreciated is that the catacombs in Paris, I mean, the actual real life locations, you know, really, I mean, it was fantastic looking at pictures of the catacombs and seeing that they'd actually taken literally the sepulchre? What's it called?
The sepulchre?
Well, whatever it's called, and they actually had a picture of it. Looks less spooky, but you know, they actually had that, you know, Mont Saint Michel. So it's really nice that it was anchored in these real world places, because even Arkham itself doesn't exist as a place, right? It's a fictional town. So it's lovely to actually have locations that are actually anchored in real places. You can see real pictures of them, and they'd use some of that art in the locations. It was just fantastic and incredibly, like you said, romantic and incredibly macabre. I mean, for example, the catacombs, like the millions of bodies that were literally dumped down holes into the catacombs, is absolutely horrific when you think about it. But it became a tourist attraction. People in the 19th century used to go and visit there, and they still visit there now. So, I mean, brilliant use of locations, not just sort of Paris itself, which is obviously and I hope the Scarlet Keys kind of has some of those aspects as well, where we have some real life locations, because I think it's great to be able to access those.
I also like how Carcosa, I think, is one of the first campaigns to really start introducing like real mythology into the Lovecraft mythos, with like even just little things like Charon's Obol, like referencing Greek mythology, and all these little kind of nods and winks to actual society. I think like really helps to make this game feel more grounded than something like D&D or something like other card games where you're kind of all over the place, where there is sort of this grounded sense when you play Arkham, despite the fact that you're using a flamethrower in space to kill Yogg-Sothoth.
Yes.
But yes, it's set in a version of our world, isn't it? So it is grounded in that aspect, yes.
Yes. Yeah. As long as there's not too many noir tropes. When noir 1950s 40s noir tropes start seeping in, I get all angry, but it doesn't happen very often.
You know, it's funny because I think Arkham is kind of at its best when it leans into some of its more pulpy tropes, at least story-wise. That's just a personal thing. I know a lot of people tend to like the more cerebral aspects of this game and sort of the what ifs and the more like horror aspects of it. But, you know, I play Arkham to shoot things, and, you know,
it's difficult to be cerebral when you're attacking a great old one with a shovel.
Like, and I think it makes more sense story-wise, like why your investigator would be walking around with, you know, a ton of guns and all these different pieces of equipment just scattered amongst their person, and like it. I don't know. I personally like the pulpier aspects of this game, but I know some people don't. But I hope they lean into it more, like with Scarlet Keys. Yes. I think that's going to take a lot of inspiration from Masks of Nyarlathotep. If I'm to be proven wrong, that'd be certainly interesting. But there are certainly a lot of little winks and nods, certainly within the location choices, and I'm sure we'll see some little winks in the campaign itself as well. But I think Masks does a globetrotting campaign really well, so it'd be a great source of inspiration for that.
Yeah, I hope so too. I hope they take some inspiration from that as well. Yeah. No, I think it's important that they balance out the two. I think you need the pulp, and I think you need the cerebral aspects of it. And I think it's inevitable that some of the 1940s, 1950s just style and iconography is going to seep in because it's more accessible in some ways. We've got a lot more movies and things sort of based in that era. And so I suppose you're going to get more of that kind of Sam Spade gumshoe stuff, even though it's not technically 1920s.
Timeline-wise, though, that's a bit. I was going to say that's a bit too new, isn't it?
Yeah,
the sort of noir stuff.
40s and the 50s.
Yeah,
because this is all set in early 20s. to mid 20s, isn't it? Supposed to be. It is. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think it also just helps to make some of the mechanics make sense, right? Like, you know, I think in a lot of circumstances, it wouldn't make a lot of sense why you'd be carrying your gun around the middle of the streets of Arkham, right? Like, why would you be doing that? That doesn't really make any sense. But, you know, if there's monsters to shoot and bad guys to kill, then yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Exactly, yeah. We got some, this was on the Out of Ammo, Out of Time YouTube comment. So Chris Deutsch says, what I like about Carcosa is that it works both mechanically and thematically. The scenarios are complex enough to be interesting, but simple enough not to feel too overwhelming. It being the second campaign really shows that the design space of an early product that still enjoys some experimentation, but the theme, the Carcosa story, captures the essence of that kind of psychological horror. The events of the campaign are relatively clear, but there are enough hints provided that the story feels like it might be a fever dream. The horror then comes from not the players being able to trust what they did as investigators. It also leaves a lot of room for role-playing or headcanon interpretations to form, allowing players to form closer attachments since they've been given the space to be co-authors of their own adventure. It hits a lot of sweet spots that way.
Yeah, I always like that about this game. Is when it makes you feel like you're part of a grander story, and that story is focused around you.
And I think it's the flexibility around it. I think that Chris is also alluding to that because of the doubt and conviction, the fever dream, it does leave it open to quite a bit of interpretation. So it gives people a freedom in terms of their imagination. So sometimes, you know, you find this, sometimes you get so caught up in the mechanics of what you're trying to do that your imagination gets a bit atrophied, or you're just being told what to do, so you're kind of just reading what's on the page. But I think Carcosa allows people's imaginations to flourish a bit more than some other campaigns. I think it does that quite well. So...
Yeah, Carcosa definitely feels like the mechanics are simple enough to not let them get in the way of the story they're trying to tell.
Yeah.
And I think having that whole doubt and conviction feeds into that as well, because it gives you that sort of different perceptions of how your character might be interpreting what's going on in front of them.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's little things like, you know, there's all the sort of whispers in your head. There's all kinds of little things it does like that, right? Which is sort of, there's just these little touches here and there which just add to that as well. So, Anathasius, friend of the podcast also, I've commented on your podcast at times, trying not to repeat myself. Yeah, really great comments. I'd say that with the theme of madness, unreliable narrator, otherworldly but not necessarily alien evil that resides within our world and doesn't intrude from outer space, for me it delivered thematically the peak of Arkham, because it's not about strong heroes killing monsters, which seems to be, aside from Dream Eaters, maybe most Lovecraftian. Mechanics feel also incredibly well connected with the theme, as you showed as well. It has some of the most memorable designs. Last King and Unspeakable Oaths come to mind. To the other cycle's credit, if you played this game chronologically, it's also hard to surpass Carcosa because it had the chance to show what this game can be very early on in the game's life cycle. Yeah.
I take it they mean chronologically, as in when it was released, as opposed to the year of the game.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yes, exactly. So, I think that goes back to that kind of, it's not about aliens and going toe-to-toe with them in outer space with a flamethrower. It's very cerebral and internal. And I suppose, there's fewer of those campaigns, so I suppose what Dream Eaters is more cerebral, if you wanted to put it that way. But the others aren't, are they?
I would kind of argue that Dream Eaters is basically I go to outer space and shoot the bad guy, but
yeah, right.
But it's a different outer space, I guess.
Yeah.
At least the B half. I think the A half does a much better job of like making that feel much more of a journey, but B side, it's basically, oh no, giant spider boss.
So that makes then Carcosa very, very unusual in the whole suite of campaigns, right? Because all the rest are kill the big bad guy in outer space kind of idea, right?
Yeah, and I think Jim Carcosa is also really the only one that has like a different boss depending on the choices that you make, if I'm remembering that correctly.
Yep.
So that's also really kind of fascinating, is that it really like every scenario makes it feel like, your choice matters in some regard. Like everything sort of leads and culminates into that one big decision at the end, which is cool.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the other campaigns have tried and have done that to varying degrees of success.
Yeah, and I mean, it's unlikely, unless there is another King in Yellow type of campaign, because really Lovecraft, as we said before, doesn't really go there. That's not really his thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, the Call of Cthulhu is just another, people are saying they want a Call of Cthulhu campaign. I'm sure one will come up, but that's just, kill the bad thing out in the ocean, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
So,
I mean, they could mess around with, like, the idea of, like, dreams again, right? Because Cthulhu is the great dreaming god, and you could, like, sort of have that be a big aspect of the campaign, or something with the stars and the star spawn, which I think is probably a better direction. We could see, like, Norman being front and center in a campaign like that, where he's, like, reading the stars, and the stars are right, and then all things happen, and then Relay comes back up, and Cthulhu wakes up, and then you bring a flamethrower to the ocean, and then those first 7 scenarios, gold. End scenario, Cthulhu with a flamethrower. But, I think that is kind of an appeal sometimes for people.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's a big reason why I love TFA so much, is that it really does make you feel like you're Indiana Jones going through the jungle, and you got that classic like rock tumbling down the spire kind of theme in the second scenario. It's so good. Yeah. And Carcosa is so personal and so different to all the other campaigns that I think that's why it stands out so much to people.
Yep. Yeah, like you say, very personal. Yeah. And so it'd be interesting. It's interesting that the new well, they're not new, but the people that are developers taking over cite Carcosa explicitly as a campaign they love. So perhaps we might see something along those lines, a more sort of internal, cerebral, self-focused campaign in the future. I guess only time will tell. Maybe the Scarlet Keys is like that. Who knows? I don't think so, but we'll see.
I mean, it'll probably be some time before we see the results of that, though, won't it? Because I think they sort of work at least a campaign in advance. So I imagine MJ has worked on the campaign after Scarlet Keys, I would have thought. So it's probably the one after that is where we'll start to see any potential change in direction or influence or whatever.
I actually think it was said during the live stream that Scarlet Keys was the last campaign that she had worked on.
Oh.
Was it?
I think so.
Okay, right. Interesting.
I'm sure someone in the comments will let me know if we're wrong, but but I believe that is the case. Yeah. So yeah, I think Duke will be the lead on the campaign following that. So.
I suppose as well with this new format, it seems to be a slightly longer time between campaigns anyway, doesn't it? It's over a year, is it now, since Edge of the Earth?
Yeah, it's around the same time frame. It's like it's kind of weird now because we get we get all the player cards first, and then we get the campaign like a couple of months afterward. But so it feels like a longer gap because you're like, as you get all the player cards, and then you kind of mess around with those for a few months, and then you're like, oh yeah, the campaign's finally out. Right. Now I gotta go play this and like replay and reuse all these cards. Because I think that was part of the appeal with the older design was like every scenario that would come out, you'd get new toys to play with. But now it's sort of like you get all the toys in advance, like Christmas Eve, and now when Christmas comes, you're kind of like, oh okay, that was fun.
So I think maybe you're right there, Nate, that maybe that we might see a synergy. So rather than one or the other, we might see a hybrid where we get, and really this new style, which allows for more complexity, should in theory allow for more diversity in terms of how campaigns are structured. And so that we can have much more of a hybrid where we maybe part of it is more self-focused and cerebral and part of it's more toe-to-toe flamethrower like you were just explaining with Cthulhu. So I hope we see that kind of synergy in the future. I think that would be good.
One thing we had mentioned on the show last episode actually was that we'd like to see like shorter campaigns as well, like just because you can add extra complexity, it also means that you can kind of do the opposite and you can make more like newer player oriented scenario packs and things like that. I would like to see products where they sort of just release a few extra episodic scenarios that you can sort of interlink into other campaigns. I really want to see this game do something along the lines of like pick your own adventure style campaigns where you kind of take a bunch of like standalone scenarios and interweave them into your own personal campaign. That would be really cool.
Yeah. Which was a bit like, with Rougarou, some of the earlier ones, there was a push to kind of insert them into the introductory scenarios to kind of make them longer and extend them out, right? There's the one in Venice.
Carnivale,
Carnivale, that kind of thing. There was that idea there, right? That you would, which seemed to sort of fall by the wayside, the idea of inserting these sort of, make your own, like you say, build your own sort of campaign almost.
Yeah, it'd be cool because like then you could sort of like dial them based on experience range, and then you could like, create scenarios with this sort of like, all right, players are going to have 0 to 9 XP when they play this scenario. They're going to have 11 to 19 when they play this, or 20 to 29. You could like dial the ranges and kind of fine tune mechanics based on the expected experience level.
Yeah. But also, like, there's nothing wrong with having Last King or, Midnight Masks fairly quick, or, Essex County Express kind of fairly quick, not overly complicated. Like, they don't all have to be like super new mechanics and super complicated, and you know what I mean? Like, it would be really good to see it mix and match as well. Like, just being okay with short, sharp shock kind of scenarios against the sort of bigger ones.
Yeah, and like, it makes me kind of think like X-Files. Like, X-Files has this kind of grand campaign throughout the series, but it also has a lot of these sort of interesting monster of the week stories kind of plugged into it.
Yeah.
And you could like kind of really take a lot of influence from that as well, and like present the investigators with some horror or something that they have to investigate, and then it ultimately ends up that some monster or some threat was the cause of it, and then they have to put a stop to it or put an end to it.
And maybe Scarlet Keys will be like that because there's multiple locations you can visit and multiple things. You can do them in any order. So maybe there are it's a real mix and match. So we'll find out, I suppose. I guess we'll find out. Awesome. Okay. So I think that's about it. Look, thanks a million, Nate, for joining us. That was absolutely awesome. Where can people find you on the interwebs if they want to find out more about the things you do?
Oh, much appreciated for the shameless plug time. I do host the Great Old Ones Gaming podcast, which you can find at www.thegreatoldOnesgaming.com. I'm also on Twitch at twitch.tv/thegreatoldOnesgaming. On YouTube, you can just search that as well. I also have been making my YouTube channel defunct for the past few months while I do my calculus homework, but I'm also on YouTube at Lost in Time and Space. And, oh geez, where else? Oh, and I also do that thing with Cameron on his channel where we review all of the player cards throughout all of the expansions, which you can check out at youtube.com/C/The Whisperer in Darkness. So that's another side series that I do with Cameron and Matastrophic as well.
Right. Is Cameron the man from Lang?
The man from Lang himself.
Yeah. Right. Yes. Fantastic. Well, that's awesome. Well, I think that's about it. So, thank you once again, Nate, for coming on. We really appreciate getting your perspective on Carcosa rather than just what I bang on about every week. What do you reckon, Kevling?
It was a pleasure. I really appreciate you guys having me on.
No worries. So, thank you everyone so much for listening. Now, next time, Kevling and I will be launching into, the Forgotten Age, which I think is your favorite.
It is. I love TFA. You'll have to have Vase on for the end of that campaign because he also loves that campaign quite a bit.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, I've got very fond memories of TFA. That was my first full campaign. I started playing Arkham sort of as Carcosa was in mid-release, so it was the first campaign I started and played through as it came out. So I got the full Arkham experience, so to speak. So I'm looking forward to revisiting it.
Yeah, and I'm sure TFA could also represent something else that people probably say about it when they're getting poisoned. But anyway,
I'm gonna drop a hot take right at the end of the episode. Here is that I think TFA is the game's magnum opus.
Ooh.
While it may not be the best campaign, it is, I think, the game's most important campaign in terms of design and storytelling mechanics.
Interesting.
Interesting.
Away I go.
I like that.
Well, leaving us all hanging like that. So anyway, next time. So thank you very much once again. I'm CrabbyTerror8, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
So as usual, thank you for listening. We're on all the major podcast platforms, so please subscribe on your podcast service of choice. And if you have any feedback, you can email us on ftextpodcast@gmail.com or on Twitter @textflavor. So on behalf of Crabby Terror and myself, thanks for listening and we'll see you next time. Bye.